And now tell me you don't need to make this.
Big thanks to Napoleon Grills for sponsoring this episode.
Today we're making brisket beef stew. And not for just any reason, it's because it's one of my leftover things. Recently I cooked pastrami for you. And I showed you in that video where the fat is in the brisket that is used to make pastramis. And of course, then you have some leftover, the point of the brisket. And as you can see, it has some beautiful meat on it, but it also has a lot of chunky fat. Now of course we gotta clean this up a little bit, and what better way to use this than turn this into a brisket point beef stew. First thing to do is clean this up and get rid of all the big chunks of fat. The amount of fat that's on this brisket is so large that if we put this in a beef stew, there would be a layer of fat sitting on top of the beef stew at the end of the cook. Now of course you can ask your butcher for a brisket point, or if you can't get it, you can always use beef chuck as a replacement. Now that this beautiful brisket point is trimmed up, you can see how good it looks. Even though it's going to be in a beef stew, I have the opportunity to create flavor with this brisket point. And that means I'm going to fire up my Napoleon kettle first. And because stewing means cooking for a longer period of time, I'm going to use briquettes. They give off heat very slowly for a longer period of time. The briquettes are hot, and I'm going to put the grill grates in and set them to the lowest position. I'm going to give my grill grate a minute to get hot, and in the meantime I'm going to season the brisket point. A good friend of mine has his own SPG rub, and we're going to use that to season the brisket point. You can see it's a fresh batch. This stuff is freaking amazing, and don't be scared to put on plenty of seasoning. Flip that around. And this is ready to go on the barbecue. And by putting this on the barbecue, I'm going to create some caramelization. What I want is for this to start grilling, getting a crunchy Maillard effect on the outside. And that means a more flavorful beef stew. That's looking good. I'm gonna flip it around, and as you can see, we got a beautiful brown crust sitting on the outside. That's what I'm looking for. Of course, I want to get it on both sides before we put this thing in the stew. I'm gonna put this on the board. Now it's time to cube this up. I want big chunks, and as you can see, this is not cooked yet, it's just grilled. The rest of the cooking is gonna be done in the stew. I'm gonna put my pan over the fire, and I'm going to let it become hot. A great way to find out if your pan is hot or not is to take a piece of fat that you just trimmed off your piece of meat, put it in a pan, let it melt, and once you get a slight sizzle, you know it's hot enough. And while the pan is getting hot, it's time for me to start chopping my veggies. This is going to be a healthy beef stew in nice big chunks. Add the carrots to the hot pan, followed by 2 sliced onions and a fine chopped leek. Stir that up and let it turn soft. To retain the heat, I'm going to put the lid on. In a lot of recipes, you see that the meat goes in first, but in this case, I don't want that. I want my meat to be perfectly caramelized and fallen apart and like super tender and soft, but I want my veggies to kind of disappear, to be part of the stew as a whole. And that's why they go in first. Once soft, the meat goes in, followed by 2 bay leaves, 5 cloves, a garlic clove, a tablespoon of sweet soy sauce, otherwise known as ketchup mayonnaise, and 2 liters of beef fond. I'm starting with 500 milliliters of concentrated beef broth, and I'm going to add 3 of these with water. So in total that's going to be 2 liters of beef broth. Now I'm going to put the lid on, and I'm going to let this simmer for at least 3 hours until the meat falls apart. It's been 3 hours, and now I want to check and see what my stew is doing. And if you can cut them with your fork, you know they're done. And now that I created the beautiful stew, I can add the last ingredients. I want to add some mushrooms, and this is my personal preference. The last 10 minutes, some mushrooms, they're going to soak up that flavor. They're going to bind the stew and make it even more delicious. I'm also going to need to add some salt, but you got to do your personal taste test to make sure that it has the right flavor. Wow. Look at this. That is a beautiful, all-natural beef stew. No crazy stuff in this beef stew, just delicious, healthy food. And I bet you can use this in the winter. I'm gonna use my beef stew with some fries. Beautiful, crispy and golden brown. I'm gonna season the fries with some PitmasterX classic barbecue rub mix. Of course, you can find that recipe on pitmasterx.com. And then it's time for the star of the show. And now tell me you don't need to make this. This is so good. Little drizzle of garlic sauce. Chop fine some chives. Sprinkle it on and your beef stew fries are done. Of course, I'm not gonna eat this by myself, alone. So I invited my friends from Skottsberg who've been sitting here all along, all these 3 hours, just waiting for me to serve them up some delicious food.